Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Released in 1951, this novel has been labeled a classic as well as challenged, and it is the narrative of a few ordinary days in the life of a dejected teenager. Now, J.D. Salinger released several short stories prior to this one, and he was notably impacted by the novel's controversial status, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the review. But he did die in 2010, so he is not so far removed from present day. But this book is set in the 50s or late 40s, basically the same time period that Salinger was writing this in. And it includes first-person narration by Holden Caulfield. That is our primary character. That's who we're getting all of the information through. And that comes with a lot of bias. So the tone itself is, because it's written through the perspective of Holden, it's very childish, and he actually admits this early on in the story that although he's in his late teens, he acts like he's 12 or 13 years old. And so the tone of this story is very annoying. You are in the mind of a teenage boy, and you will never have the chance to forget that, I promise you. And it's also very matter of fact. There's not a lot of reading in between the lines when it comes to this plot. As far as the actual narration goes, it's very basic syntax. And what I mean by that is often, along with the fact that you don't really need to read too much into it, the sentences are basic, very subject, verb, object, just the basic, simple structure of a sentence. He also has a lot of repetitive thoughts and repetitive vocabulary. So if there's anything that, like an adjective that he uses in the first paragraph of the chapter, you're going to hear it 10 more times before the chapter ends, I promise. But also when it comes to phrases, he says these three particular things often throughout the book. I hate it when, XYZ. Not that I think, so-and-so is a terrible person, stuff like that. And also it depresses me. He says these three phrases so many times that it loses meaning, and you get the sense that he's not being all the way truthful when he says these things. As we know, if you say something enough times, it kind of loses its meaning. So he also has a tendency to use absolute language, and that's mainly through the word always. So someone who is speaking and has basically an excuse for everything, he's not really taking a lot of responsibility in his life. For example, if things go bad, he'll say something like, people are always ruining things for you, or someone's always doing this, or someone's always doing that. Again, he says it so many times that we're led to believe that obviously this can't all be true. And throughout the story, we see a lot of self-inflicted situations that he's in. So we know for a fact that that single statement isn't necessarily true. He ruins situations for himself as well. He has run-on thoughts that often span half the chapter. So there are times when whole paragraphs are irrelevant to the plot. So you'll start the chapter, within the plot with him going on whatever adventure he's going on. And then he'll have just a thought, and he'll expound upon that until the chapter ends. And then by the time we get to the next chapter that is picking up right where the beginning of the last chapter ended, we kind of forget what's going on. So that was quite annoying again. I really can't find a better word to describe the narration of this other than annoying, but it kind of makes sense because this is a teenage boy that we're getting the story through. So In addition, there's a lot of descriptive language that is attached to almost everything, every person, everything, every situation, and that also is very tiring. So there's a lot of adjectives, there's also a lot of cursing. And the reason I point this out is because it taints the way that the audience views things. So this is where that bias comes into play. We know with first person narration, you can't necessarily trust everything that this person is saying because people have biases, whether it's unconscious bias, subconscious bias, or it's them outwardly choosing to see a situation differently than what reality actually is. But something as simple as labeling everything around him, that, we have no other information to go off of, and so we're just assuming that these people are in line with the adjectives that are being used to describe them. So for example, fat ass Ed Banky. Why was that even necessary? Or talking about even things, the goddamn footsteps, the goddamn this, the goddamn that, or the dirty stinking moron knees. He really didn't need to say that. Why would you even need to describe someone's knees as dirty stinking moron? Obviously he was mad, during the time of this description, but this happens so often, it really gets old, because everything doesn't have to be the goddamn door or this stupid that or this stupid that. It's crazy. Also, he uses old a lot, and in this context, in this time period, it kind of just means, like good old sport or something like that, but he'll call people like old Spencer or old Phoebe or, good old so-and-so. But that's more of a time period thing. And lastly, he has below average articulation. So along with everything that I just listed, sometimes his sentences just don't make any sense at all. So for example, I pulled this one out. It was a very stupid thing to do, I'll admit, but I hardly didn't even know I was doing it. What is he talking about? What is he talking about? What is he saying? I don't know. But again, if we're looking at this from the perspective of he's supposed to sound like this because he's a teenage boy, then that's great. But it's kind of difficult to read through. So let's talk a little bit more about the character that is Holden. Unfortunately, there's not too many other characters that are worth mentioning, because along with the fact that we're given a very tainted view of them, most characters don't really last more than a few pages, and we don't really get enough information to break down the character, or other characters aren't really as impactful to the plot. So we're just going to talk about Holden, but there's so much to talk about. So again, he's in his late teens. He's a very lost person. He's apathetic. He has no goals, no motivation, it seems. There's nothing that really interests him. So he's not working towards anything at all. He's also very arrogant and deluded, so he often exaggerates his abilities in reference to other people. So for example, Ernie is a piano player, and he's described as being a very good piano player, but in his deluded thinking, Holden has said that he is so good that he's not good anymore, and that he could probably play the piano better than Ernie. Which is, what type of rationale is that? Or he also says, I have terrific capacity in reference to drinking. And that's not true. We see that firsthand because he actually gets very, very drunk. And he's unable to control his actions for a short period of time. And so that can't be true either. So he's very judgmental. As I mentioned earlier, he has a tendency to label everyone around him, and it's almost a compulsive need to put people in a box and put people in a place so that it justifies his treatment of them, or his, the thoughts that he has. He rarely ever has a positive thought about anything, and that includes the people around him, whether it's his roommate, his so-called friends, even family members, people he meets on the street. So for example, Ackley is described as terrible, Stradlater is described as a secret slob. Phoebe he describes as perfect, that's his little sister. Sally, who is supposedly a person of interest for him romantically, he describes her as a pain and actually says that to her face. The cab driver he describes as touchy. Ernie, again, he describes him as arrogant and not talented. And himself, he describes himself as an exhibitionist, but what I pull from that is he really only has a personality when he is putting on a show or when he's being watched. So the rest of the time, which is a lot, it's a good portion of this book where he's not interacting with other people per se, he's just walking around with his thoughts. He has no personality. He's just thinking or making imaginary scenarios in his head, or he's thinking back to situations he's had with other people, or he's just talking about how terrible another person is. So he doesn't really have anything for himself besides when he's talking about, someone else's skills. He'll say, I bet I could do better than that, or I bet I can do better than that. But if you could, you would, and maybe you would have a life. So now the theme. Clearly, the first theme here is teenage angst. And that's, I like to describe as the time where it's like around puberty and you're just finding your way. I think often I associate this time with maybe middle school or high school. And this is just where, young people are finding their way, finding what they want to do in life, finding friend groups, figuring out even their personalities, like who they want to be in life. This is, I think, often the time when people experiment with like hair color, stuff like that, just finding your look, finding what it is you like to do in life. And so it's expected, that there's some turmoil there, that it seems very shallow to maybe some of us that have passed that stage. But I would argue that in some capacity, everyone does go through this stage. But Phoebe, who is actually his little sister, described it perfectly. She said, you don't like anything that's happening. He's always complaining about everything. There's not one thing that he likes. And they had a conversation where she outright asked him, what do you like to do? What is it that you like? And he had a hard time thinking about it. And it's like, come on. Like, we're all lost at some point in life, but there has to be something that piques your interest, even if it isn't education. What do you enjoy doing? Now, there's a certain level to him that is very naive, and that stuck out to me because this is someone who is at this private school that, even though, he's kind of getting closer to being a young adult, he's away from his family, he's living on his own, he's experiencing some sort of independence, and yet he still seems like a child in a lot of ways. And again, he has described himself as acting like a 12 or a 13-year-old. So for example, this very peculiar question of where do the ducks go in the winter? If the lake freezes, where do the ducks go? I found it very odd, one, that he was even asking this question. And two, he should know, but why is he even thinking about it? And wouldn't it be obvious, that obviously they're not in the lake, so they're going somewhere else? I don't understand why this is something that he is stuck on. But to me, even if you don't know the answer, it doesn't take too many steps in thinking to get to that answer. I didn't look it up for myself as to where ducks exactly go in the winter, but I would assume it's somewhere warmer. They're not just going to sit out there. So I don't know if there's like a certain level of comprehension that maybe just isn't there for him. But that was one thing that certainly showed how naive he was. Another topic is sex and intimacy. He has a lot of questions about it, and I think he's yearning to become more versed in these topics, whether that's building a connection with someone else or even just finding out more information. But this is recognized through his conversation with his former classmate, Carl. And he's asking him all these like personal questions and wanting him to describe things. And it's strange because this is someone who he hasn't spoken to in years. And he just called him up one night just to have drinks. They were only, out together for maybe a few minutes. And he's asking all of these questions. So it's just very strange to me. And lastly, this whole idea of him daydreaming about this extravagant life that he's gonna live, and not extravagant in wealth, but like he has it in his head that he's gonna move out west, or he's gonna marry Sally or some other girl. He's just gonna find someone to marry. He's gonna find a job out of the blue. It's not really specified what he's going to do. He's gonna raise children and homeschool them, and this is all without the general interference of the world. This clearly shows that he's afraid of something in the world because he wants to isolate himself as well as whatever family he may have in the future, and that's a problem. I think that shows his naive side because, one, you're not just going to make it just because you want to get away. I think it's natural for people to want to run away from, maybe their hometown or maybe their parents or something like that. And although it's not always possible for people to plan these things out, it's not reality for you to just decide to do all of these things and it's just going to happen, So I feel like I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of like 18, 19-year-old Tiana. But I feel like at some point you have to recognize that you have to get out of your head if you want to make stuff like this happen. You can move out west and you can start a whole life out there, but what are the steps you're going to take? He was just going to go out there with no money and bum a ride all the way out west, which we don't even know where out west is, by the way, but whatever, and build a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Just no concept of really how the world works, so that's scary. He didn't end up doing it though, but still. And the last theme I want to talk about here is companionship, because this is really what he's seeking. And it's funny because in a way he pushes away most of the relationships that he does have. He doesn't really try to work on relationships with his friends, or when the opportunity presents itself with women, he doesn't really put the effort in to maintain those relationships, but it seems as though he's just seeking a companion. And this is shown through his date with Sally, his when he had drinks with Carl, when he visited Phoebe, and lastly when he visited Mr. Antolini. He also describes himself as lonesome. He has no core set of friends. There's no one that really recurs in the story. Once he leaves a place, a setting, we don't really hear about that character anymore. So this is just one lonely kid. Now, the reason I picked this book up, one, because it was in like the classic section. And so I was like, okay, I'll give it a read. It's a classic. And two, after further research, I realized that it was one of the few books that was on the banned book list. So why was this book on the banned book list? Well, again, it was released in 1951. So a lot of what's discussed here, it opposes most commonplace practices in the 50s. So for example, the idea of religion, even him questioning slightly in the book, was offensive back then. There's a lot of curse words, vulgarity, and sexual references. And it's interesting because I think that at some point we should take a look at if the things that are being banned presently are a reflection of what's to come in the future. Because I got about a third way through the book and I could not for the life of me realize why this was on the banned book list. And so I kept thinking, okay, well, maybe there's going to be a controversial event that's going to happen at the end, that would make it something, kind of touchy or taboo or anything like that. But it took me a second to realize that the things, like even just talking about sex, like it's 2021. All you got to do is go on Instagram. And so there was nothing in here that surprised me or shocked me or even offended me. But placing myself in the 50s, clearly that was a whole different time period. And so it made me think about the future and the things that are being discussed now as controversial. Maybe that'll be commonplace in the future, and obviously it's not on the banned book list now, but I just find it interesting that even I think as late as, I think I read maybe 2005 or 2003, it was still one of the more challenged books. Also, I forgot to add this on here, but it was said to have a lot of references to communism, and we know how that was in the 50s. They didn't play about that at all. So I guess, clearly it doesn't need to stay on the banned book list anymore, but when we look at those lists, we should probably look at the time periods associated with it, and that'll put it into perspective. As far as the classic status, okay, this is named as one of the best novels of the 20th century, and the reasoning behind that is because it, depicts a good take on teenage rebellion. I don't know here's the thing. I really want to have a great respect for the classics. And the reason I am picking up so many of them is because obviously, as far as literature goes, a lot of books are built off of the foundation of these classics. And a lot of authors that I'm reading now took their inspiration from people like Shakespeare or James Baldwin or the Toni Morrisons of the world. And so it's important for me to understand that foundation so, I can go further in writing, but I don't feel like this is a classic book. Even when I put it into perspective and think about the time period, there were other writers that were writing pieces far better than this. And I don't understand for the life of me why it was considered a classic ever, or still is. As far as the whole teenage rebellion thing, I didn't really see that rebellion side. What I saw was someone who complained about everything, who was very narcissistic and was very pessimistic. There was nothing groundbreaking about this. It just showed someone who was lost. I mean, maybe it's just that this whole angsty teenager story is just no longer my niche. This is not something that I find interesting at all. But to me, the plot wasn't interesting. We literally followed him around for maybe 2 or 3 days and watched him complain about everything. Every situation he was in, he would complain, then leave, find another situation to put himself in and complain about. There were no interesting side plots. There were no interesting side characters. We didn't really get a glimpse of anything else significantly enough to change the pace of the story. Like it was, I don't know. And when you add into the fact that the narration was so all over the place, like his thoughts were just kind of all over the place. I was reading it and I felt like there were a few times where I really felt like this character had some type of mental illness. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was because I don't think that was the intention. But if someone has an inner monologue like that, I don't think that's healthy. And it was suggested in here that he go to a psychoanalysis. I think that's what they called it. I think he certainly needs a psychiatrist, this character, because he doesn't really seem all there. And it's tough to read a perspective like that because, again, you're not really sure if everything is as it seems. I think every character that we meet is tainted by Holden's narcissism. He believes everyone is terrible at whatever it is that they do. He's not really experiencing reality in that sense. But I will say the book has 2 redeeming qualities, and they both come at the very, very end of the book, the very end. Mr. Antolini's speech on finding your way in life. I really enjoyed that speech. that was the first time I really felt myself engaged in the book, you know? It was nice to actually perk up a little bit, and I enjoyed what I was reading at that point. And that was just basically him reassuring Holden that he isn't the only one that's been lost. He isn't the only one that has been, in despair or just kind of questioning what they're going to do with life. And so I really enjoyed that piece. And I felt like he should have been a more present character. I felt like they could have, Salinger could have played off the dynamic between those two as a mentor-mentee and engage that in the plot a little bit more, and it would have been, something to give us some type of relief from the nonsense that is Holden. And second, his relationship with his sister really brings out the rational side of him, because beforehand, he doesn't really seem, again, like he's all there. He doesn't seem very level-headed. His thoughts are all over the place. His moods are kind of all over the place. But when he interacts with his sister, he just seems like a regular person, along with the emotional baggage that he has. But we get to see this side of him where we can feel a little bit of empathy. And so again, I feel like that character should have been present a little bit more to show that side of him. I do think, however, that it took too long to get to this point. These characters should have been introduced maybe, I would say maybe about a quarter of a way through the book, so that by the time we're getting really sick of Holden and his antics, we're able to see that there are people around him with some type of common sense and that can guide him on the path, and kind of, see him deal with their feedback a little bit more. Because by the time he gets this advice, it's the end of the 2 or 3 days that we're with him. So we don't really see how he implements any of the changes, if he has any changes in his life. So honestly, when it comes to takeaways, here's the thing. This book, I think it should remain, in history as one of the banned books of the late 90s or whatever it was, because that shows, how far we have come as a culture when it comes to, creativity, and even just on the scale of like the conservativeness of the education system, or whatever. This, however, does not deserve classic status, in my opinion. I think that there are way more writers that write with substance and there is a message behind it. I didn't really learn anything from this book. If anything, I learned that I was probably, if I was anything like Holden, I was the most annoying person in the world. And I feel so sorry for anyone who interacted with me in my teen years. So that's what I learned. But most importantly, and this is something I learned a few years ago, Holden makes a lot of excuses for himself. Nothing is ever his fault, ever. If anyone says anything to him, he has a whole story concocted about why things didn't go his way. I want everyone to remember one thing. Excuses are tools of the incompetent. And there's a little more to that, but that's the most important thing. Don't be incompetent, Sometimes things don't work out, and sometimes it is your fault. Fix it and go on with your life. So thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. Hopefully, Hopefully I will have a better book review for you all next week. I am working on reading some plays by Shakespeare that I just bought, so I'm not entirely sure if those will be regular episodes, because there's 4 plays in this one book that I bought, or if that'll be like a series or something like that. But, as always, if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.